Hi, Max. We meet again, right? It's nice to see you again, right? Max is a dear brother of mine. We have worked on several projects before, several dialogues before, and the first time I got to know Max, it was through the CBD fellowship that takes place in my office at China Street, and ever since I got very intrigued by him, and I see him and I hear him, uh, there's a mismatch on how he looks and how he sounds, but I will leave that to him to introduce a little bit more about himself. But Max is an international speaker and also the director of Thinking Faith. He is very passionate about looking at current affairs through the biblical perspective, through the biblical lens. Max is born in, I believe, Sri Lanka, and then he moved on to Australia, whereby he graduated from the National University of Australia, and he has worked as a lawyer as well as a parliamentary advisor. And now I believe he is residing in Singapore with his family. Right, so let's put our hands together and welcome Max Jeganathan from Thinking Faith.
Thanks, Reagan. Thanks, everyone. Thank you for that applause, brother. Thanks for joining. Well, yeah, thanks everyone for being here. Thanks for giving us some of your time. It's a real pleasure to be with you. As you can hear, I'm very much an Australian. I grew up in Australia, spent most of my life there, but I was born in Sri Lanka. I'm a Tamil, left Sri Lanka when I was 1 year old. And so spent most of my life in Australia. And then I got the blessing of studying in Oxford in the United Kingdom for a couple of years, did my postgraduate study there. And then my wife and I, as Reagan said, we've been in Singapore for the last 4 years or so. So because we've gone online for this event, because we were kind of hoping that government restrictions would ease, but that's okay. We've just shortened and sharpened the event slightly, and so I've just trimmed my talks down a little bit. All of the data and the research that the experts gave us over the last 18 months are that when you're online at an event, people stop listening after 17 minutes. So, which means I've got about 3 minutes left before you all fall asleep or focus on your breakfast. So I've trimmed my talks down. Both talks will be shorter. We've kept the Q&A at the same length, and we're going to have a small group discussion to break it up. But I do understand that this is not ideal, but hopefully, this will be useful for all of you. I want to speak to you broadly on two topics. The first is this question: what is truth? Now, it's interesting because for most of human history, people have always had different ideas of what is true. We have argued about it. We have fought about it. We've even fought wars over it, about what is true. But over the last probably 50 to 60 years, for the first time, we have begun to have a discussion about whether or not truth actually exists. There's an old movie that has a fascinating scene in it where there are two thieves who have stolen a cash machine. They've stolen this ATM, and they've got it in a wheelbarrow, and they're wheeling it down a busy shopping street in broad daylight. Obviously not very bright, but they've stolen this ATM. They've ripped it out of the ground. They're wheeling it down the street, and they see a police car turning in at the top of the street, and they don't know what to do because they obviously can't outrun the police car. They don't want to lose all of their money in the ATM that they've stolen. So they ditch the wheelbarrow and they put the ATM up against a wall of a shop just on the street. And one of the criminals stands at the ATM pretending to use it as if he's using it. And the second guy stands behind him as if he's waiting in line to use the ATM. And by the time the police car drives past and the officer looks across at this stolen ATM that's just resting up against a wall, there's a line of 7 people waiting to use this ATM, which is not even plugged in. Now, we find that amusing for 2 reasons. One is because many of us here are Singaporean or living in Singapore, and we love standing in lines. In fact, in Singapore, we're happy to stand in a line even if we don't know what's at the end of the line. It's just the principle of a good hawker stall is just go and stand in the one with the longest line, right? So that's part of it. But the other reason that this story is both funny and troubling is because all too often in our world today, people are willing to stand in line behind people, are willing to follow people, are willing to accept things without looking into it for themselves. Now, it's not a big deal if you're standing in line for an ATM and you get to the front and realize it's not plugged in. But it's a big deal if that is how you are making decisions about the big questions of life. questions of faith, questions of meaning, questions of purpose, questions of morality, questions about the deeper things of human existence and the deeper yearnings and needs of the human heart. On those big issues, we need to check things out for ourselves. Whether we are Christian or not, whatever we might believe, whatever we might subscribe to, however we might think about this thing called truth, it makes sense for all of us to think more carefully about what we believe and why we believe it, which will enable us to ensure two things. One, that we are actually believing in something that is true. And secondly, that we are able to defend what we believe, defend what we think in the face of attacks or in the face of contradictory or countering opinions. And so it's in the midst of this world where it's increasingly confusing about what truth is or whether truth even exists. I want to talk about three different approaches to this thing we call truth. The first approach is anti-truth thinking. The second approach is post-truth thinking. And the third approach is truth seeking. Anti-truth thinking, post-truth thinking, and truth seeking. And for better or worse, out there in the world today, whether we're on the streets, we're in the marketplace, we're in our churches, we're in our family homes, we're on Netflix, we're on Disney Plus, we're on Spotify, whatever we're streaming, our literature, our poetry, all three of these categories of thinking about truth are constantly being pushed towards us. All three at the same time in varying degrees: anti-truth thinking, post-truth thinking, and truth seeking. And so it's really important that we are willing and able to take a step back sometimes and think about what each of these things are. Think about the degree to which each of us might be affected or influenced by each of these three, and think about what actually works, what actually makes logical sense, coherent sense, and makes for the most flourishing of lives, that optimizes our joy, our happiness, our peace, and our flourishing. So first of all, then, anti-truth thinking. Now, as I said, for most of human history, thousands and thousands of years, everyone agreed, generally speaking, that there was this thing called truth, and that it was what corresponded to reality. The thing is, people had different ideas about what that was. And of course, we had different systems of government, different systems of economics, different systems of religion and philosophy, and everyone had their own understanding of truth. But everyone understood that truth was absolute and that truth was exclusive. And so while we disagreed on what was true, no one disagreed that truth actually existed. And then in the 20th century, we had these terrible world wars, the first two industrialized world-level wars, where people were just massacred, where there was anxiety and suffering and desolation and destruction economically, personally, nationally, across the world. And when people came together after the Second World War to try and rebuild a post-war order, which is actually the same post-war order, at least economically and financially, that we're living in now, there was a group of people that said this can never happen again. In fact, most people said that. But this particular group of people tried to find the reason why we had degraded into this kind of conflict. And the reason they said was because everyone has been fighting about their own versions of truth. We had communism, we had capitalism, we had socialism, we had National Socialism, we had Nazism. And it's because of all of these competing accounts of truth, that is why we have erupted into conflict again and again and again. And so this is an oversimplification, but what this group of thinkers came down to was, you know what? When we look through history, every time someone claims truth, what's really happening is that people are just wanting power. They just want to assert their truth claims over other people for their own benefit and at the expense of others. Truth is simply a power grab. Truth is simply a grab of selfish human exploitation. And you know what that means? And this is the kicker. They then said, therefore, there can only be one solution. Truth does not exist. Truth does not exist. Now, we had been through a few rounds of the Industrial Revolution, and we had entered what the pundits were calling modernity. And so these people came post-modernity, and they said there is no such thing as truth. And that's where we get the phrase postmodern, because they came in the mid-20th century, and they said there is no such thing as truth. And of course, there were people before that talking about this, but it really took hold after the Second World War. And they said there is no such thing as truth. And this was the kind of apex of postmodern thinking. Postmodern thinking, which I have called anti-truth thinking. This idea that there is no such thing as truth. There is no such thing as truth. And we hear it out there today. There is no such thing as truth, or similar and related comments like, we can't know what truth is. There's no way of knowing. These absolute claims that truth either doesn't exist or it's not possible for us to know what it is. And we hear it and we see it all over, not just our city here, but all over the world and all over the internet today. Now, how do we deal with this worldview of anti-truth thinking? And is it a worthwhile worldview to subscribe to? Well, I want to put to you that it is not. And here is the reason. There are many, many things that could be said, but just in a few minutes, I want to share with you what I believe to be, the most prevailing reason why anti-truth postmodern thinking doesn't work. It doesn't work because it fails logically. If someone says to you, there is no such thing as truth, all you have to do, or if you are sitting there right now believing that there is no such thing as truth, all you have to do is ask that person, or I will ask you, was that sentence true? Someone says there is no such thing as truth. All we have to do to rebut it is to say, was that true? What you just said, was that sentence true? If they say yes, they're admitting that there is such thing as truth, and their sentence, the substance of their sentence, self-destructs. If they say no, then they are agreeing that their sentence wasn't true in any case. So you see, when someone says something like, there is no such thing as truth, they are making an absolute truth claim. And so they can't be right, because they are trying to say there's no such thing as truth except for this sentence, which defies logic. So they contradict themselves. There is no way, therefore, of claiming that truth does not exist without contradicting yourself. And so we know by virtue of logic alone that truth has to exist, that absolute truth has to exist, and that we can know what it is. Because any denial of those three things self-destructs. Okay, I'm going to go through it very slowly again. Someone says to you, there is no such thing as truth. All you have to do is ask them, was that true? And straight away you've exposed them, because they have to answer yes or no. If they say, yes, it was true, well, then you say, and it's clear that their sentence is not true, because they're claiming that there's no such thing as truth, but they're making a truth claim. So they're self-contradictory. If they agree that their sentence is not true, then they're straight away agreeing that the substance of what they've said is not true or relevant. So we see, just using the principles of logic, that postmodern anti-truth thinking doesn't work. And it's interesting to note here that I haven't talked at all yet about Christianity, about the Judeo-Christian worldview, about the Bible. We haven't gone near any of those things. You don't need to be a Christian. You don't need to be a supernaturalist. You don't need to be a theist at all to accept everything that I have just said. So what I've just said in breaking down anti-truth thinking is not a Christian critique. It's in fact just a logical critique, because anti-truth postmodern thinking fails logically. What about post-truth thinking? We hear this term more and more often these days, post-truth, post-truth. Well, there are a number of ways of defining post-truth thinking. The simplest way is that post-truth thinking is thinking with your feelings. Anti-truth thinking says truth doesn't exist. Post-truth thinking says truth doesn't matter. Even if it exists, it doesn't matter. What matters are your feelings. Your feelings are the most important thing. If anyone hurts your feelings or makes you feel bad, that needs to be raged against and railed against and obstructed and stopped. We need to stop people sharing. We need to cancel. We need to stop people disagreeing. We need to stop people messing with harmony. Because if anyone is hurting anyone's feelings, that comes first. That is actually the most important thing. Post-truth thinking. And this generation has been labeled a post-truth generation, but the reality is, as we look through human history, post-truth thinking has been there since Adam. Since Adam and Eve, there has been post-truth thinking. Post-truth thinking is the inherent, broken, sinful human instinct to put our feelings before truth, to put our feelings first. Feelings first. How you feel, what you want comes first. C.S. Lewis, in his great book, The Abolition of Man, he says there are two ways of living. One is to try and find the truth and then conform your life to the truth, to the reality. The other is just to look at what you want out of life and try and twist your reality to conform to what you want. That's post-truth thinking, putting our feelings before truth, putting our feelings first. And while anti-truth thinking fails logically, post-truth thinking fails morally. It fails morally because post-truth thinking says, all that matters are my feelings. I'm the most important person in the world. And so it places each person at the center of their own moral universe. It's a very inward-looking way of experiencing reality and navigating through the world. This idea that I'm the most important thing, that my values are the most important, my decisions, my religion, my philosophy, my opinions, my preferences, my interests are the only thing that matter. It's deeply, deeply self-absorbed, and it's deeply selfish. And interestingly, in what I think is probably the best definition of the word sin outside of scripture, we see Martin Luther and St. Augustine both writing that sin is men and women curved in on themselves. Sin is men and women curved in on themselves. That is a perfect depiction of post-truth thinking. People curved in on ourselves, just looking inwards rather than looking outwards, looking at what we want, looking at how we feel, putting ourselves at the center of our universe. That's post-truth thinking, and that fails morally. And here's why it fails morally. Because if we are the center of our universe, sooner or later, people outside of ourselves who disagree with us about anything or who get in the way of us actualizing our desires and our preferences and our convenience and our comfort, we will begin to think of them as lesser people. There was a show on Netflix a few years ago called What If, where Renee Zellweger plays a billionaire sociopath, and she manipulates people. She uses all kinds of leverage and extortion and blackmail just to get what she wants. And there's a very powerful line where she says, "Do you know what I hate the most? Having to deal with the moral ideas of lesser people." Having to deal with the moral ideas of lesser people. And when we assume a post-truth mindset, an idea that my feelings are the things that matter most, we begin to think of other people as lesser people. We don't just disagree with people. We put them on a lower existential plane to ourselves. We think of them as lesser than us. We reduce who they are. And that's why post-truth thinking fails morally, because it tells each person in the world, all 8 billion of us, it says you are more important than everyone else. But it does that to everyone. So it's not just a recipe for chaos practically. It's deeply, deeply self-absorbing and inward turning to people morally as well. So anti-truth thinking fails logically because it self-contradicts. Post-truth thinking fails morally because it puts our feelings first before anything else, before truth, before justice, before fairness, before peace, before service, before love, truth, feelings before everything, not just truth, feelings before everything. So it fails morally. So what then is the solution? Well, the solution is what I'm going to call truth seeking or true thinking. And truth seeking doesn't make either of the mistakes that anti-truth thinking or post-truth thinking does. Because first of all, it acknowledges that truth exists. Truth is that which corresponds to reality. Truth is that which corresponds to reality. So then the only question is, because we're not denying that truth exists and we're not denying that we can know it, the question is, how do we find it? And finding truth conceptually is very, very simple. And once again, you don't need to go to the Bible for this. Plato, the grandfather of modern philosophy, said, finding truth is simple. All you have to do is follow the evidence to where it leads. All you have to do is follow the evidence to where it leads. Now, the problem in the world today is that because we put our feelings first, people are willing to follow the evidence, but only insofar as it's convenient. People are willing to follow the evidence, but only insofar as it's convenient. And there are sad examples of this inside and outside the church, in politics, in economics, in cultural debates, where people make up their mind about something, they decide how they feel about something, and then regardless of whatever evidence comes up, they will not shift from that position. The best example is vaccinations over the last 18 months. Someone decides that vaccinations are a bad idea or they're evil or they're coercion of the state or something. And it doesn't matter how many doctors come out, how many pastors come out, how many ethicists come out and say, hey, it's a good idea to get vaccinated. People won't budge. That is a failure to follow the evidence to where it leads. That is a failure to follow the evidence to where it leads. Because the human instinct, because we are naturally turned in on ourselves, the human instinct is to follow the evidence for as long as it's convenient and it feels good. We follow the evidence for as long as it's convenient and it feels good. And many people who consider themselves Christians, when you talk to them about how they actually gave their lives to Jesus and made that decision to become a Christian, they said, I actually knew the truth for a while. Finding the truth and the evidence wasn't a problem. It was accepting the truth that was a problem. I knew what I had to do. I just didn't want to do it. I was worried about what I might have to give up or what I might lose or what other people might think of me. And that's a very natural human instinct. It applies to all of us, Christians and non-Christians, seekers and skeptics, atheists and theists. The natural tendency to only want to follow the evidence while it's convenient, while it feels okay, while I've still got my friends, while I'm agreeing with those around me, while I'm getting my Facebook likes, while I'm getting my Instagram followers. We follow truth only insofar as it's comfortable, because Plato says that's not good enough. If you want truth, you've got to follow it to where it leads. And my submission to you this morning is that if you follow the evidence to where it leads with an open heart and an open mind, and you keep following it your whole life, regardless of where you end up and what you believe and what you practice, it will lead you to the person of Jesus Christ. It will lead you to the person of Jesus Christ. The evidence, existentially, experientially, anecdotally, anthropologically, psychologically, all of it leads to the person of Jesus Christ. And that's why he so powerfully says, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. I'm the way, the truth, and the life. So we see that according to the Christian message, truth is not just a set of propositions. It's not just something to believe in. It's not a set of philosophies. And when you look at the etymology of the word religion, the Christian message is actually not a religion. Christianity is not a religion on any measure. It's a relationship. Because for us, the truth is not propositional. It's personal. It's a person. It's embodied ultimately in a person. If it was embodied ultimately in a series of steps or things to do or rules to follow, then it would be a religion. But it's not. It's primarily embodied in a person. And that relationship precedes all of the practices and routines and everything. If you took away all of our church buildings, there would still be the gospel of Jesus Christ. If you took away the liturgy, there would still be the gospel of Jesus Christ. If you took away all the worship songs, there would still be the gospel of Jesus Christ. If we stopped celebrating Christmas, there would still be the gospel of Jesus Christ. All these practices and routines and institutions are good things, but they're all subsidiary. They're all less important and less relevant than the primal central pillar of the Christian message, which is a relationship with a person, God himself, Jesus Christ. So what does that actually mean in a post-truth world in terms of finding truth and navigating truth? When we are understanding this Christian message and seeking to make sense of it for ourselves, when we're wrestling with our own doubts and questions, and when we are seeking to defend this faith and explain it lovingly to those around us who ask us questions about it, there are two things we need to remember. That this gospel of Jesus, if it is true, it can stand up to questioning. So that's the first thing. We shouldn't be afraid of questions. It's one of the reasons where your church has decided to have an event like this, because it wants to create an environment where questioning is natural and questioning is encouraged and questioning is important. And it is. Again and again, we see it in the Bible itself. God says, come, let us reason together. We see it in 1 Peter chapter 3. Always be ready to give a reason for the hope that you have. We see people throughout Scripture who are doubting again and again, questioning, skeptics. The Samaritan woman at the well, Thomas himself looking at the resurrected Jesus. They all want evidence. They all want evidence. And what does Jesus do? What does God do in response to people who don't believe or want evidence? He gives them the evidence. He answers the questions. He provides the explanation. So this is a message that is true. Because it is true, it can stand up to questioning. So we must never be afraid of questions. And we must always ask our questions. Because if it's true, it should be able to stand up to questioning, robust questioning. And that's the beauty of truth seeking and true thinking and a true approach to reality and life, is that we should be interrogating and questioning everyone and all worldviews all of the time. We should be thinking critically. We should never just take an answer and trust it blindly, because that's not what the Bible says. The Bible says we are called to trust, but not blindly, on a very strong basis of trustworthiness. And most of the Bible is God spending pages and words establishing his trustworthiness for you and me, which ultimately culminates in him stepping into the world as a person. That's the ultimate demonstration of trustworthiness, is the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. But it's not blind trust that he's looking for. It's reasonable, thought through, evidence-based trust. And that is truth seeking and true thinking. And it is a combination of two things. All of the evidence that I've talked about propositionally, whether that's biblical evidence, archaeological evidence, anthropological evidence, scientific evidence, anecdotal evidence, experiential evidence, whatever it might be. We've all got questions. And so there are answers to those questions, propositional answers with providing propositional evidence. But then secondly, there is the relational evidence. The evidence that we actually get of a living, loving relationship with Jesus, having the Holy Spirit living in us and with us, having God fellowshipping with us, living lives of love and fellowship with other followers of Jesus with us, being plugged into a church community, being plugged into a midweek cell group, community, having transparency and accountability friendships with one or two or three other people that are meeting regularly and praying for each other. This is the relational evidence of the truth of the gospel of Jesus. And secondarily, as I've said, there's all the propositional evidence too. So there are always answers to the big questions, but more importantly than that, there is a person at the end of those answers, and his name is Jesus. And he, for the Christian, is ultimately the embodiment of truth. So those are some thoughts on what truth is. Hope that's helpful, gives you some things to think about. I will throw it back to Reagan, and I think we might have a break before I give the second talk.
Right, thanks, Max. Wonderful. I think you have shared a lot on what truth is, especially on the part of anti-truth, post-truth, and truth-seeking. It's a blessing for me, and I believe it's a blessing for everyone here as well. We will now go for a short break, a 5 minutes tea break, a toilet break, and then we'll come back for session 2.
So it's been obviously a chaotic and an uncertain couple of years, and the big driver of that has obviously been the pandemic. But what's interesting when we look back through history, certainly we look back through each of our lives, if we're honest, it's always been quite turbulent and chaotic. The management theorists and the economists came up with the term in the 1970s called VUCA, V-U-C-A, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And they talked about the VUCA world. And when the term was coined, they were talking about the Cold War, and they were talking about instability in financial markets, hyperinflation, and so forth. And then, things kind of settled down. And then we had the information, the ICT revolution, the internet took hold. And then we had the dot-com bust. And then we had the Asian financial crisis. Then we had the global financial crisis. And before all of that, we had 9/11. And around every corner, there seemed to be some new black swan event, some new explosion of uncertainty that came. And every time it happened, the theorists would say, oh, the world is more VUCA now than it's ever been. And then, of course, we had a pandemic, and now they're telling us it's VUCA again. So what we can see and what we know from our lived experience and just from reading the newspapers is that the world is always VUCA. It's always volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And when we look at the biblical view of the world and of history, that's exactly what we would expect. The explanatory power of the Christian Bible is enormously insightful when we look at the uncertainty and the intrinsic volatility of the world. Because according to the Christian view of the world and the Christian view of reality, there are two things that are intrinsically broken: the world outside of us and ourselves. We are broken and the world is broken. You and I are messed up and the world is messed up. And because of that, there is always going to be uncertainty. There is always going to be some element of chaos. The question then becomes, how do we navigate the chaos? Well, at the moment, I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, have either been watching or have watched or are going to watch or have heard other people talking about Squid Game. So Squid Game is breaking all kinds of international records on Netflix. I think it just topped the most viewers for an online streamed launched series in history. I think it just topped that last week at some 30 odd million or something like that. Now, when something is that popular, it doesn't mean it's good, but it does indicate that it tells there are insights in these sorts of TV shows and pieces of entertainment that tell us something about ourselves. And it's the resonances with the human mind and the human heart that often will draw people of all worldviews to certain things. And there are interesting things that can be said about Squid Game. It's obviously dealing with a world of uncertainty and chaos. It's dealing with adversity. It's dealing with suffering. And there are various themes. There are actually about 5 or 6 talks, that I want to write when I think about what you could say about that show. But one thing that interests me is how people deal with the chaos and the suffering in Squid Game. Not what the suffering is so much and the entertainment value of the cinema around that, but how people deal with it. And broadly speaking, in that TV show, as is the case in everyday life, in real life, there are 3 prevailing responses. And these 3 prevailing responses sit at the heart of the cultural narrative on how we should deal with chaos. The first is to try and avoid it, right? It's a very natural human instinct. If there's chaos, you just try and avoid it. Try and stay out of it. Try and stay away from the suffering. Just avoid it. Secondly, when you can't avoid it, we try and escape it. So first we try and avoid. Second, we try and escape. And when neither of those things are possible, as sadly is the case for almost every character in that show, it's resignation. We just resign ourselves to the suffering. We just accept, I'm messed up, the world is messed up, this has happened, that has happened. I just have no choice but to just grit my teeth and try and get through it. So avoidance, escapism, and resignation are the cultural responses of the prevailing modern culture to chaos and suffering. Avoidance, escape, and resignation. And none of them are particularly helpful. They're not compelling. They're not satisfying. They don't give us any kind of hope. They don't give us a way of navigating through the chaos and the suffering. We just try and avoid it. We just try and escape it. And if neither of those work, just suck it up, shut up, and deal with it. That's the response. How does that stand in contrast to the Christian response? What does the gospel have to say to, in a practical sense, in an experiential sense, to the chaos that we have been dealing with for the last 2 years, yes, but more importantly, to the chaos we are all dealing with all of the time in our hearts and in our world around us, with or without a pandemic? There's no shortage of reasons for chaos, and there's no shortage of storms. It just so happens that we have shared a storm in this last couple of years, which is the pandemic. Sorry, that's just the garbage truck going past. I'm on my balcony. Okay, so if the world is telling us avoidance, escapism, and resignation, that's the way to deal with chaos. What are some ways that we can overcome that? What's a better way? What's a more compelling way? And ultimately, what is the Christian way? What is the Christian response to navigating a chaotic world? There's a lot that could be said, but there are at least 3 things that we need to do. First of all, we need to learn to navigate the uncertainty. Secondly, we need to rethink independence. And thirdly, we need to deal with suffering. Not run away from it, not try and escape it. We have to deal with it. So we need to navigate uncertainty, rethink independence, and deal with suffering. Now, on navigating uncertainty, as I've said, the prevailing cultural understanding is that we need to try and predict the chaos and avoid it. We need to try and predict it and avoid it. But we know that's just not possible. There's a sociologist called George Ritzer who coined a term, McDonaldization. I think it was in the 1950s or 60s when the McDonald's fast food chain was really exploding. And Ritzer said that there are 4 characteristics of industrialized modern societies, 4 things that we are all going for. And living in Singapore for the last 4 years, there is no better city in the world that strives for these 4 things. No better city in the world as an example of making these 4 things our ultimate objective and our symbols of success. And the 4 things are these: efficiency, productivity, calculability, and control. Efficiency, productivity, calculability, and control. And George Ritzer's point is that all 4 of those things are becoming more and more difficult because things are unpredictable, they are uncertain, they are volatile. There are shifting sands geopolitically. There are shifting sands in terms of supply chains, in terms of digital disruption, even in terms of, our global currency markets, crypto, distributed finance. No one really knows. Wage cost inflation, supply chain constraints, demand pull pressures, supply push pressures. And that's just talking economics and politics. Beyond that, there's all of the continuous struggles of human anxieties. Divorce rates continue to go up, suicide attempts continue to go up, loneliness, anxiety, depression, all continues to rise. We're struggling with the bigger collective issues like climate change. We continue to grapple with issues like racism. The brokenness intrinsically and the uncertainty intrinsically of the world makes necessarily trying to predict the chaos and trying to avoid it and navigate around it increasingly impossible. George Ritzer's McDonaldization, he called it McDonaldization because McDonald's offered the drive-through. And drive-through, what he's trying to symbolize with the metaphor is that we are a society that wants just to get what we want quickly, predictably, calculably, and with control. We want to know what's coming. And we want to just be able to click and collect. And that's why the whole kind of Amazon Prime, 2-hour delivery, Red Mart to your door, drive-through culture, just beep and go, is very much symbol of this thing called McDonaldization. The idea that we know what we're going to get, we can get it with certainty and security. We see something we like, we just click, we touch on our screens and it turns up. It's all very obvious and easy. The problem is what the pandemic has shown us is that there are things outside of our control that can come and explode all of our predictability, explode all of our productivity, explode all of our efficiency. No one would have thought, that such a high percentage of the OECD countries would all go into clinical recessions last year. No one would have picked it. It took a microscopic virus, right? An enemy that's completely indiscriminate to take down literally and grind to a halt some of the most robust economies in the world, including this one, including Singapore. We went into a recession. We had to start eating into our reserves. No one thought this would happen. No one thought this could happen to countries and economies as strong as the modern industrial countries. And so if that can happen to nations, obviously it can happen to you and me as individuals. And so we need not to try and predict what's going to happen with the world, because that is just not possible. What we need to do is to learn to navigate it. And for that to happen, we need an anchor. We need an anchor in the storm, not a prediction of the storm, not a weather forecast for the storm. We need an anchor in the storm. We need an anchor that holds us strong to who we are, to our identity, to what we believe, to where we're headed, regardless of what's happening around us. And the best analogy is the anchor in the storm, because what the world tells you is to just make your boat better, make it bigger, deck it out, put a body kit, put better engines in it, put better carpet in it, put a TV in it, put a fridge in it, put a better crew on it, self-improve, go and do classes, get your MBA, go and apply yourself, get your next promotion, get your PhD, go to the right universities, go to the right schools, send your kids to the right places, get the right condo, get the right car, get the HDB in the right area, right? That's all self-improvement. The idea is that we can predict what's going to happen and plan for it. We diversify our investments, we plan our holidays. The Bible's been telling us for thousands of years, those are all stupid things to build your identity on. Right? Trying to plan and assume that you know what's going to happen. And the pandemic has reminded us all of that. What we need is an anchor in the storm, because it doesn't matter how good our boat is. If the anchor is not attached to something outside of the storm, our boat's vulnerable. And that's how an anchor works. An anchor has to attach itself either to the ocean bed or to the land. Otherwise, anchors don't work. It doesn't matter how good a boat is. In a storm, it'll get thrown around unless it's anchored. So we need to stop working on our boats, and we need to start thinking about where our anchor is. So that's the first thing we need. To navigate uncertainty, we need an anchor in the storm, not better boats, not better boats. Second thing we need to do is rethink independence. Now, independence, again, particularly in Southeast Asian and South Asian societies like ours, independence is a big thing. We want to be thought of well. Status is big. We're an honor shame community. And because of that, we strive to be, and we strive for our children to be, independent. And when we talk about independent, we talk about financial independence, emotional independence, mental independence. We don't like the idea of dependence. Dependence has modern connotations of weakness, whereas independence has modern connotations of strength. Interestingly, in the Bible, that's completely inverted. That's completely inverted. Independence is correlated with the Bible with failure. Independence is correlated with selfishness. Independence is correlated with worldliness and pain and anguish and despondency and ultimately death. In the Bible, independence is the beginning of a path that ends in death. Frank Sinatra famously said, "I did it my way." That idea of self-actualization has always been on the human heart. It's part of the intrinsic brokenness of people. I just want to do it my way, build myself up, improve myself, so I can take care of myself and take care of those around me in my own strength, based on my own ability. And so we love phrases like self-made man, self-made woman, right? And so when people like Jeff Bezos and Richard Branson go into space, there's an element of admiration because these people have built themselves up, or so we say, from nothing in their own strength, through their own ability. Whereas deep down, we know that no one's a self-made man. There's no such thing as a self-made man or a self-made woman. We've all had help. We've all driven on roads that have been paid for by other people. We've all been to hospitals that have been built by governments that we didn't work for. We've all been cleaning air that's been regulated through air pollution legislation that we had nothing to do with. We've all turned on taps and the water has come out, and we've never done any plumbing in our lives. And there's no self-made people out there. We're all deeply, deeply dependent. And so Frank Sinatra's idea of self-actualization is actually not old or new. It's always been there. The current modern version, the millennial or post-millennial version of this idea of independence is you do you, your best self, your best life. That's just the modern versions of Sinatra, my way, right? It's the same old thing. It's been there for thousands of years. People just wanting what they want for themselves, independence in their own strength. But we know, as I've already outlined, that there's no such thing as true independence. In fact, even if you happen to be so fortunate that you are financially independent, for example, that's well and good. But if you build your identity on that, then all you've done is you've become dependent on the idea of financial independence. If you're emotionally independent and you build your identity on that, then you're just dependent on the idea of emotional independence. So we're all dependent on something. There's no such thing as true independence. Everyone's dependent on something. Some people are just dependent on their idea of independence. That's all. But we're all dependent on something. So the question then becomes quite clear to us. How do we rethink independence? We rethink it because flourishing doesn't come from not depending on anything. Flourishing comes from using our independent freedom to make the right choices to depend on something that is worthy of our dependence. That's what we need to do. We need to choose to depend on things that are worthy of our dependence. We need to choose to depend on things that are worthy of our dependence. So to navigate uncertainty, we need to find an anchor for our identity in the storm. And to rethink independence, we need to find something worthy of our dependence. Thirdly, and finally, we need to deal with suffering. Easy to say, definitely not possible to unpack it in my remaining 4 minutes of this talk. But suffering is endemic to the human condition. We are all dealing with it. Everyone on this call is dealing with suffering right now, either directly or through the lives and experiences of someone close to them, a loved one. Suffering comes in all shapes and forms. It doesn't really care how rich you are, what your passport says, what your bank account says. It's just a sad reality of human existence that suffering is real. Marilyn Robinson, the great Christian writer, she won a Pulitzer Prize. She said, there are two realities that plague all of creation: my insufficiency to the world and the world's insufficiency to me. As I said earlier, that unpacks the two realities that the Bible sets down, that whatever you do and whatever I do, there are two things we can't escape. I'm not quite as I should be, and the world around me is not quite as it should be. Doesn't matter how hard I try or how much I apply myself, I'm a little bit broken inside. It doesn't matter how hard we try and improve the world around us, it's a little bit broken outside. Yeah, Singapore's a great example because we flourish so well on some indicators of flourishing. GDP per capita is strong, infrastructure is good, transport infrastructure is good, health system is good. And yet, in the Singapore Business Review recently, Singapore is now officially ranked #1 in the world for the unhappiest workforce on the planet. 48% of Singapore residents are unhappy in their jobs. #1 on the planet. Probably the highest quality of living on the planet on any other economic measure of success, and yet the unhappiest workforce. In a youth council survey from the Singaporean government a couple of years ago, showed that 1 in 4 Singaporeans between the ages of 10 and 29 years old have clinical symptoms of depression or anxiety. 1 in 4. 1 in 4. And we are right up top as far as Asia goes in suicide attempts and successful suicides too. So what does all of this tell us? It tells us that there is more to flourishing than money. There's more to flourishing than good infrastructure and good health, education, and employment outcomes. But what it also tells us is that in our own strength, we can't eliminate suffering. We've done everything that we can do. I feel so blessed to be living in this city. It's probably achieved the best quality of life of any city, alongside any other city in the world. And yet there are things that we still can't get rid of. There's still suffering that we can't eliminate. That human brokenness is still there. That societal brokenness is still there. So that points to the ubiquity of suffering. Suffering is ubiquitous. It's absolutely everywhere. The question is, how do we deal with it and how do we respond to it? Now, suffering is not a Christian problem. It's a human problem. Non-Christians suffer, Christians suffer, atheists suffer, theists suffer, skeptics suffer, freethinkers suffer. Because of that, it doesn't matter what you believe. Everyone has to have an explanation for how their worldview responds to suffering. So this is not just a question for the Christian. Everyone needs to be able to respond to suffering. And there are many categories of responses out there. I'll briefly go through them categorically without going through the actual specific worldviews. There's one category that says there is a God, but he doesn't really care. There's no moral connection. He's just all-powerful and almighty and off in the distance. You don't get to ask him about your suffering. If you're suffering, that's just his will. You just need to shut up and deal with it. There's another category of worldview that says that all suffering is your fault. It's all the fault of the sufferer. Either something they did in this life or a previous life, that's why they're suffering. There's another category of worldview that says that it's an illusion. That what you have to do is meditate yourself to a point of nothingness, to extinguish the self, where there's no more desire or connection to anything, and then you won't suffer anymore. And then there are the atheistic worldviews which say of suffering that it's meaningless. Because as Richard Dawkins wrote, we are nothing but time plus matter plus chance, according to atheism. And if we're nothing but time plus matter plus chance, everything is meaningless. If there's no transcendent realm, if there's no supernatural realm, there's nothing to give objective meaning. And so life is meaningless, therefore suffering is meaningless. And so we have to give our own meaning to it and just deal with it. Now, the problem with those four responses is it doesn't give us the two things that all people are looking for. And ultimately, these are the two things that the characters are looking for in Squid Game that sadly none of them actually get. None of them get it. The two things that we are all looking for amidst the chaos, amidst the uncertainty, amidst the suffering are comfort and strength in the chaos and hope of a future beyond the chaos. Comfort and strength in the suffering and hope for a future beyond the suffering. And then when we turn finally now to the Christian message, to the gospel of Jesus Christ, we see a God who literally steps down into our suffering and suffers for us, goes to a cross, takes all of that brokenness I was talking about onto himself, does away with it, dies on a cross on our behalf, rises from the dead, thereby affirming who he is and thereby defeating suffering and all of evil. And in and through that, he now reaches out to each of us, offering us relationship with him through Jesus. And in that, he offers us the exact two things that we're looking for, that all people are looking for, in the midst not just of suffering, but in the midst of chaos, in the midst of anxiety. He offers us comfort and strength in it to get through it right now. And he offers us hope beyond it, hope of an eternal future where there's no more suffering at all. And that's where we see that Jesus actually is the answer to all three things. In navigating uncertainty, he's the anchor. He offers us to give us a source of our identity. In rethinking independence, he's the one worthy of our dependence. He's proven it by coming into the world and dying on a cross. That's a declaration not just of love, it's also a demonstration of trustworthiness. It's a demonstration of trustworthiness and dependence worthiness. He's worthy of our dependence. And thirdly, the cross of Jesus Christ is quite simply the most compelling response to human suffering in human history, offering us comfort and strength in it and hope beyond it by offering us a God who's willing to walk with us through the suffering. Jesus died for us and suffered for us, and now he's willing to suffer alongside us and suffer with us. He takes our hand and he says, we're going to go through it. We're not going to try and avoid it. We're not going to try and escape it. We're not going to resign ourselves to it. We're going to conquer through it. And that's the difference. Jesus Christ conquers through the suffering, not around it or in spite of it or instead of it. He conquers through it. And that's why he remains the pathway through which we can navigate, not just a chaotic present, but an uncertain future as well. Thanks so much for listening. I went a little bit over time. Reagan, back to you, mate. And then I think you're going to split people up into groups.